A court in Bangladesh is hearing a petition to remove the state's religion. Why is the issue being raised now? And what difference will it make to the country? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Well, Bangladeshi courts are considering removing Islam as the state religion. There have been a number of attacks against atheists and religious minorities in recent months. But the petition being heard was originally filed in 1988 when it was all but dismissed back then. So why is it being reconsidered now? What do supporters of the petition hope to achieve by removing Islam as Bangladesh's state religion? Lots to discuss with our guests, but first, Al Jazeera's Mahir Sattar sets up the story for us from Dhaka.
Today, like most days, the Hosni Dalan exudes tranquility. But last October, the scene was different in the Shia house of worship in Dhaka. Multiple bombs ripped through a procession here during celebrations to mark a holy month, killing 2 people and injuring dozens more.
It's not just Shiites who come here, a lot of Sunnis come too. An attack here is a problem for the security of everyone.
A month later, 5 alleged members of the banned armed group Jamaatul Mujahideen were arrested for the attacks. The assault on this house of worship was not an isolated one. Since last year, there have been attacks on atheists, Hindus, and Christians, raising concerns that Bangladesh is becoming less tolerant of religious diversity. Retired Professor Anisuzzaman says this was something he was hoping to prevent when he filed a petition back in 1988, challenging Islam's status as Bangladesh's state religion. That was shortly after an unpopular military ruler made it the Muslim-majority country's official faith in a bid to gain legitimacy. But in the aftermath of recent religious violence, people like Anisuzzaman believe the revival of his petition is timely.
It's always better to correct a mistake or a wrong, even if it's after many years, than never to correct it at all.
But the announcement of the hearing has sparked controversy. Sunni Muslim groups have said they will resist any changes. And on Friday, after midday prayers, they took to the streets to voice their opposition. Back at the Hosni Dalan, a police patrol keeps a lookout. As tensions rise over the outcome of the court hearing, minority worshippers here say they are worried about their future. Mahir Sattar, Al Jazeera, Dhaka.
Well, for more on this, let's bring our guests into the show. In London, we have Abbas Faiz, a South Asia researcher who focuses on Bangladesh. In Dhaka, joining us on Skype, Shireen Haq, a founding member of the women's rights group Nari Pocha. And in Birmingham, Talha Ahmed, a Bangladeshi political commentator and lawyer. Good to have you all with us. If I could start with Abbas, why is a petition that was filed in 1988 being heard today?
I think there are 2 contexts to this. There is a current context. There is also a historical context. The current context is that it will be helpful to the authorities. I know that the verdict may not, there may not even be a verdict. Even if there is a verdict, it may not be implemented, but the deliberation itself and the media attention that has been given to it will benefit the authorities on at least 2 counts. First, they will be able to sell it as an example of their determination to implement secularism in the country, because a large section of the people inside the country are wanting that. And the second thing is for the international consumption, because at the moment Bangladesh is under heavy pressure to tackle Islamic radicalism. And rather than doing it directly on that count, they can say that they are determined to do it, and this will be very convenient.
All right, convenient for authorities. Talha, though, who is pushing for this when Abbas talks about the authorities? Who are we talking about, the ruling party?
Yeah, I mean, the authorities, we're talking about ruling party, but I would go slightly deeper than what Abbas says. I think the issue that we need to look at is two things. First of all, we are told that if we bring about that change and get rid of Islam as a state religion, it will facilitate greater secularization and therefore create a more level playing field, an inclusive country. And the other is that it would aid our Bangladesh's battle against ISIS and other growing extremist Islamic issues. But I don't think either of those objectives will be served, or indeed they are the main motive. I think the main motive is, as Abbas said, is to use this as an opportunity for the Bangladeshi government to show their determination to international community and also to a section within the internal Bangladeshi society that they are determined to bring about secularism. But ultimately what we need to recognize is that this state religion they talk about, it has no effect in reality, either in law or even in terms of actual state practice. Bangladesh constitutionally is a secular state, it is a people's republic, and in fact it has never been an Islamic republic. So for me, the whole debate is actually a smokescreen.
Well, Taha, we'll get into that in a second about what difference this will make. But before we go that far, I want to bring Shireen into the discussion. Shireen, of course, your organisation submitted a petition similar to this. This is, of course, the courts are looking at a different one. But your organisation submitted a similar petition to this many years ago. Were you surprised that a petition like this is now being heard in the courts?
Yes, actually, we were the first ones to file a petition in 1988 when the 8th Amendment had just gone through Parliament. We also heard through the press that this was coming up for a hearing. We were a little bit surprised, but I have spoken to one of the people who are involved in this particular petition, and they have actually been bringing it up since 2011. So in a way, there is. It is not that sudden as it appears. They've been pursuing it since 2011. And the reason why it has come up at this particular point is not, I think it has just made it to the roster at this point. But not without the pursuance of the group that filed that petition.
But are you at all concerned, Shireen, that I think the sentiment we heard from Talha there is basically this might be the whole issue might be manipulated for political or other reasons. Are you concerned about that possibility, Shireen?
Yes and no. The whole introduction of Islam as a state religion was a political move anyway. It was not something that was being done out of any particular devotion to the religion. It was at the time that General Ershad was ruling the country, and this was very much a political stunt on his part to try and manipulate the beliefs of the majority of people in this country. And so religion has been used over and over again by different political groups as and when convenient. Mm-hmm. So if it is being used as a smokescreen now, I will not be surprised, but I have no information with which to actually assert that is the case. I think that in the case of the petitioners, it is a genuine pursuance of the petition, which is based on their returning to fundamentals that were promised in our first constitution before these amendments took place. So whether the government is using it to play up to the international community or to play up to its own internal constituencies, I don't know. I don't think I can say with certainty as Mr. Taha did.
Okay, I want to go back to Talha. You mentioned there the practical difference that this might make to life in Bangladesh. Will it make any practical difference whether you're secular or religious? Does it, if this petition goes ahead or it's rejected, is there much at stake practically?
In terms of law, it doesn't. I think we need to understand the context. This was introduced by a dictator in 1988 on the face of growing unpopularity, and he fell from power 2 years later. And so it was never intended to bring about significant lasting change in terms of law and how state deals with different religion. And so it didn't make any difference then. The current government, who were in power between 96 and 2001, and then they were in power from 2008, they brought another change, I think, about 4 years ago now, in which they reintroduced the provision that Bangladesh is a secular state. So secularism became a fundamental principle of Bangladeshi constitution. And in that amendment, again, they retained Islam as a state religion. So I don't see, for me personally, I don't think it's a big issue whether Islam is recognized as a state religion or is not recognized as a state religion. But the reason I'm concerned and wary about this debate coming to court at this point in time after 28 years is that it is going to create and play the sentiment and the emotion of a very large number of people, which ultimately will result in more persecution and in fact more limitation of religious expressions in the country. So I don't believe it serves anyone's purpose. What we should have is a proper and mature debate about whether Bangladesh as a country facilitates right for religion, right for freedom of expression, right for people of no faith to also express their views. If it doesn't, how can we make sure that it does? That is the debate we need to have.
You mentioned a really interesting point there about, as you said, limitations of the freedom to express yourself religiously. I do want to pick you up on that in a moment, but before we do, you've also touched upon a little bit of Bangladeshi history, and perhaps it's useful for us at this point to remember that Bangladesh hasn't always had a state religion. When the country won independence in 1971, the newly formed constitution declared it a secular state. But an amendment pushed through by former President Hussein Mohammad Ershad in 1988 made Islam the state religion. Now, the current Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina, has implemented several reforms to bolster Bangladesh's secular nature. But the state religion has been preserved so far. 90% of the population, of course, identifies as Muslim. Hinduism and Buddhism are the main minority religions in Bangladesh, though. Abbas, what do you make of the argument that this petition ultimately would bolster perhaps minority rights, individual freedoms and so on and so forth? Do you read its potential impact on Bangladeshi society in that way?
I don't think so. I think the problem is that this debate, we are talking about the debate technically, if it had been in the context of furthering other freedoms and this development, kind of adding to a better protection and respect for human rights, then it would have been an entirely a different issue.
But what about, Abbas, forgive me for interrupting, what about the counter-argument that says, given the context of rising attacks against intellectuals and bloggers and so on and so forth, that it might help, the argument goes, create more space for people to express themselves if the Constitution no longer states there is a state religion?
But exactly, that is what I was going to, cover, Sami, because at the moment we have serious problems with the right to freedom of expression in Bangladesh. We know that there are numerous cases against editors and against the journalists and other people who are expressing their views who happen to be critical of the authorities. For example, there are many cases against the editor of one of the most prestigious newspapers in Bangladesh, the Daily Star. But to just add to what Talha was saying, I would like to actually add some context on the historical context, because when we talk about 1971, we must remember that 1971 was only 3 years away from 1968, and we know that the youth in the Western countries was overwhelmed, in 1968 by the ideals of, secularism and defiance of religion. And those ideas were translated and recycled in, Eastern societies as well. So they were actually in the minds of the people who created the Constitution of Bangladesh. We know that also that is the period when Maoism had a lot of influence on, on the youth in South Asia. And again, that is not compatible with religion, so there was also an acceptance of secularism. And at that time also, some of the Islamic parties had kind of opposed the independence of Bangladesh. So the architects of the Bangladesh constitution were very conscious of all of these developments. So there was acceptance in society about the prevalence of secularism and the fact that it should be reflected in the constitution. There's no problem about that. In fact, but the problem is the way it is being used, because secularism recently is being used in Bangladesh as an ideology. It is not a process, because in the constitution, it is a process. It is a process that enables all the minorities to express their views. But in Bangladesh, it is being used as an ideology, and it is being used as a lever to actually violate some human rights. And some of the human rights are being violated. The right to life is being violated. Other human rights violations are taking place in the context of unfair trials, for example, is another one. The right to freedom of expression is being violated under the concept of imposition of secularism.
Okay, hang on. Let me jump in there.
Changed.
You've made some really good points, Abbas, and I want to take it to Shireen. Listening to our other guests on the show, the idea is coming across as very clear that this won't have any positive impact on the life of individuals and minorities in Bangladesh, I think is what we're hearing from our other guests. And in fact, particularly in the case of Abbas, that secularism might be being used to oppress human rights. What idea did you have in mind when your organisation submitted this petition? What practical difference did you think this could make to the life of individuals in Bangladesh?
I think we had three particular concerns at the time that we filed our petition. And one was that the promise of a secular state in our first constitution was being abandoned, and that was a concern as what else might get abandoned along with that. But also the adoption of any religion. Our concern was really not with Islam per se, but the very notion of a state religion so soon after we had broken away from a theocratic state, that the adoption of any religion will in effect mean discrimination against people from other religious backgrounds.
Do you still have those concerns, Shireen, today,
yes,
if we fast forward?
I do. And I think Mr. Talha is right that perhaps in terms of the actual legal framework, there has not been any, there has not been any substantive changes made. However, the messaging is very important. What message it gives to people, to society, to cultural groups, etc., that is very important. And I think the third concern we had was that the adoption of a state religion would henceforth mean for women's development and gender equality that it would be based much more on religious values rather than on more universal values of equality and rights. And here again, I would say we were relieved that it did not make that much of a significant impact, but it did signal some constraints. So yes, equality, but only so far. Yes, rights, but only so far. A lot of this is informed by the fact that Islam is our state religion now. Now, this is not to say that I remember speaking at the first press conference in 1988 when we were waging a movement on the streets against the Eighth Amendment, that we would have come out in protest even if Buddhism was made the state religion, or Christianity or Hinduism. So our opposition is not so much on religious grounds to Islam per se, but to the idea of a state religion.
But Shireen, do you then disagree with Abbas when he says actually the concern now is more not about religion being used to oppress rights, but secularism being used, as he said, as a lever to pressure people's rights?
I totally agree with what he has said. I myself have been a victim of this. I was prosecuted last year for contempt of court, and I have to say that the very fast shrinking space for never mind dissent, for even just differing views, is frightening to all of us. And it doesn't matter whether Islam is the state religion or not, or whether the ruling party calls itself secular or not. This is the reality that we are faced with today.
Talha, it sounds like there are really some much bigger issues at play here than simply Article 2A of the Constitution and whether it says there is a state religion. It sounds like what we're really talking about is the entire direction of the country.
Absolutely. And I think the problem we have is, whenever we talk about the right of individual to express their religion or express their belief in no religion, we often get detracted looking at one segment of the society. So take the issue about silencing media and so on. Abbas mentioned one newspaper. He didn't mention the name, but one of the most popular English newspaper. We also know other media organizations and newspapers and editors who's been behind bar. And what's interesting is that some of the leaders of Jamaat-e-Islami, the largest Islamic political party, they were in the first instance arrested for insulting the religion of Islam and the Prophet. So you can see how the state manipulates Islam when it suits itself, and also when it manipulates the secularism and idea of liberalism in order to suppress others. So really the debate and the discussion that we need to have, and the consensus that we need to be seeking to achieve, is that as a state in Bangladesh, what are the changes that we want to achieve in the civil society, in the legal framework, and also ultimately how do we develop capacity of the state in order to enshrine values of respect, of democracy, of justice and fairness. None of these values at the moment are enshrined. The other thing we need to remember is this. In Bangladesh, there are issues about persecuting minorities, silencing individuals' right to speak freely. But those suppression have never happened by Islam as a religion or Muslims as a group. These suppressions has taken place under numerous governments claimed to be secular, nationalist and others, and never any of those issues were properly investigated and properly tried before court. So let us not, fancy a discussion thinking that...
Okay, yeah, so sorry, Talha, we've got only a few minutes. So I want to give Shireen and Abbas a chance to come in. Shireen, do you think it's time to broaden the campaign that organisations like you and the petitions have, like your organisation, have launched into some of the wider issues, like Talha was saying there, whether it's respect for human rights or perhaps even the broader issues? I mean, Bangladesh still has, what, a quarter of its population at least living under poverty. It's got serious issues with dense population, political polarisation. Do you think it's time to move on from just
change
this?
And many other problems? But you are probably aware that our present government has actually dispensed with the idea of democracy as not being a priority because we are making such fantastic gains in terms of development. I think, yes, of course, and in fact, since 1988, my own organization has gone on to broaden its agenda to many other issues. The one that I have been personally involved in all of last year and continue to be is the one fighting for freedom of expression. And here I must say I disagree with Talha a little bit that we were caught between the devil and the deep blue sea.
Right.
Here, the state, and on the one hand you have state repression on any dissenting views, on even differing views,
right.
And you have religious groups who are either fanatical or
okay, Shireen, sorry, I'm going to have to jump in because we've got 60 seconds left. I want to take Shireen's point there, Abbas, in 60 seconds or less now. How much of Bangladesh's stability is at stake here, depending on what the court decides?
I don't think it's going to make any difference, but I think it is going to be an excuse for the government not to do anything as they've never done about the mass attacks on Hindus, the mass attacks on Buddhists, the mass attacks on Christians. No one has been brought to justice. Attacks against secular bloggers, very, very few people have been arrested, and no one has been brought to justice. So it's not going to be really a lot of good news for many human rights activists.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave the show there. It's been a fascinating discussion, so let's thank all of our guests, Abbas Faiz, Shireen Haq and Talha Ahmed. And thank you for watching too. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter, our handle @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here, for now, is goodbye.